who made it.
This is the Abolitionist and Underground Railroad Downtown Art Walk in downtown Greenfield, Massachusetts. It's a tour of 12 different historic sites tied to the abolitionist movement in Greenfield, and also potential sites of Underground Railroad activity. I think it's important for the community to be able to discover this history. At each of these 12 sites, we have a mural painted on the sidewalk, which illustrates the history of the site, and so people can kind of naturally discover this history and learn about it. There's a QR code they can scan at each location, and they'll be able to learn the history of what took place there. So we have the tour today at 9 a.m., which will last for a couple hours, and then from there, there is a webpage that people can access with a self-guided tour that they'll be able to take for the next year or so. We're hoping the murals will last about a year. I think it's great that we're able to partner with so many artists. We have the 12 different sites, and we have 8 different artist teams, 9 different artists in total working on the project. And we're able to partner with the Juneteenth event that Empress Banu runs, and so we're having it here on Juneteenth before the Juneteenth events. I think it's just very important to be able to connect all this as one cohesive narrative for Greenfield. Just a big thank you to the New England Foundation for the Arts and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. They were able to provide the funding and the training to put out the call for art for this project, and enabled us to hire all the artists who were able to create these great murals. All right, great. Thank you. Take 2. All right. Hey, Luke. Good. Ready.
Okay, so before we start with some of the specific murals and characters and events, I think it's important to provide a little bit of context about slavery in America before we start. I'll try not to take too much time with that, but the first enslaved people arrived in America around 1619 in Virginia, and slavery existed in all 13 British colonies that would become the U.S., including Massachusetts. We have record of enslaved people arriving as early as 1630 in Massachusetts. Most slavery in New England in the colonial and revolutionary period was around sort of industrial and coastal areas, not so much the agricultural rural areas like western Massachusetts, though we do have record of enslaved people here in Greenfield and even more in Deerfield, which was bigger at the time. Most northern states began to abolish slavery toward the end of the Revolution and shortly after the Revolution. Massachusetts abolished slavery in the early 1780s through the Supreme Court of the state, actually, not through an act of the legislature, but the Supreme Court in the series of cases in the 1780s declared that it was incompatible with the state's new constitution. And those cases actually involved enslaved folks from one woman from Sheffield out in the Berkshires and another from Barre, Massachusetts. So both somewhat local cases. So we were the first state to fully abolish slavery in the new country. Pennsylvania had passed an act before Massachusetts, but it was an act of gradual emancipation. So Massachusetts fully abolished it I think by 1783. In the South, of course, it existed in far greater numbers. Not quite in the way that we typically think of large-scale plantations in the 1800s. In the colonial period, it was far smaller in scale. Many prominent men of the South, founders of the country, who themselves owned enslaved people, many actually thought it would sort of gradually fade away as an institution. That it didn't, not because they had any moral qualms with it necessarily, but because of it not making economic sense. That is until the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which kind of revolutionized the cotton industry, made it far more efficient to clean cotton, and therefore the scale of cotton production as a cash crop in the South exploded in the early 1800s. So just to give you some sense of scale, the first census taken in the U.S. was in 1790. There were about 700,000 enslaved people. In 1860, just on the eve of the Civil War, there were 4 million. So if you look at that on a chart, it's a pretty drastic increase over the middle of the early and middle 19th century. And most of the folks we'll encounter today, most of the activity around Greenfield will be sort of in the era of the 1830s to 1850s as the abolitionist movement really kind of gained some steam. So the first character, and the reason we're meeting here at this site first, it was the site of the home of Dexter and Eunice Marsh. Dexter was a common laborer. He was not an educated man. He was not a professional. And he is best known, the reason all of this is here, he is best known as a sort of amateur paleontologist and fossil collector. He's the one who found the dinosaur footprints while they were laying sidewalk right here on Bank Row. Those footprints and a lot of his collection are actually in the Benesky Museum at Amherst College. And what we know of his abolitionist activity and potential activity on the Underground Railroad comes mainly from an anecdote, as a lot of them will, you'll see on this tour. And the anecdote comes through his daughter, Arabella, and from his daughter to a niece of hers, I believe. And the story is that, and I have some quotes here, the niece, whose name was Sophia Woodman, had heard from her aunt Arabella, daughter of Dexter, that Arabella came home one day, this would be in the early 1850s, I believe, to find the yard full of black children with whom she played delightfully until nightfall. They were gone the next morning, and when she asked her stepmother, Eunice, where they were, Eunice replied, "What black children, dearie? There are no black children. You must have had a very interesting dream. Now run along to school and don't talk about it." So as Arabella grew older, she realized that her parents may have been playing a role helping fugitive slaves to safety further north. There's no other documentation of their activity on the Underground Railroad. Even Arabella and her niece admitted that their memories were probably imperfect, but Dexter's father, there are things that kind of lend credibility to the story, namely that Dexter's father was a known, quote, abolitionist to the core, is how he was described. He was from Montague, his father Joshua. And so this is the site of their house. They also later had a house, or before, I can't recall, on Wells Street, kind of right across from the skate park. That house is still there that Dexter lived in. But this is the house where that story originates. Okay, thumbs up from Carol. So I think with that, we're going to move to the next site, which is by the courthouse. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. There's a mural here we should all take a look at. The artist is Larry Bond, and if Larry would like to say anything, they're certainly welcome. I'm not actually sure which artists are in attendance and which are not. So if not, we can obviously, I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to interpret any of the art for you necessarily, but folks can take a look, and we'll spend a minute or two before moving on. Yeah. No, Larry.
Great start.
Okay.
He didn't mention that the Historical Society
Or is it empty?
If you want to, just get it. Alrighty.
This is the site of the Methodist Church from 1834 to 1846. And at the Methodist Church in December of 1836 was the inaugural meeting and the first few regular meetings of the Franklin County Anti-Slavery Society. So in the 1830s, there was sort of a wave of grassroots abolitionism across America. And the heart of this movement was really local anti-slavery or abolitionist societies. Slavery was an increasingly contentious issue not only because of the growth of the numbers that I mentioned before, but the growth of the country. So as the country expanded west, every time a new territory was added or a new state was incorporated, it reignited the debate over whether slavery should be allowed in that territory or state. A very delicate balance was being sort of struck in Congress. And so, for example, when Missouri is added as a slave state in 1820, the compromise is that Maine is added as a free state, which had, broke off from Massachusetts to be added as a free state, and maintained that balance in Congress. So neither sort of dominated. So that went on, particularly in the 1830s and 1840s, especially after the Mexican-American War gained the U.S. Wide swath of land in the American Southwest. And so in in Massachusetts, by 1837, there were 200 local anti-slavery societies. The Franklin County Anti-Slavery Society had initially 92 members. So in December of 36, they met at the Methodist Church here. They elected officers, came up with a business plan, and I'd like to read from their inaugural constitution that they adopted that day. They wrote that slaveholding, it's a direct quote, slaveholding is a sin and ought at all times to be regarded and treated as such. They pledged their organization to, quote, labor for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and the territories, promote the moral and intellectual improvement of the colored population at home, and to remove public prejudice. So we'll meet some characters that were inaugural members and board members in the next few stops of the Franklin County Anti-Slavery Society. Hello. These societies did a number of things, but most commonly they sent petitions to Congress. In the 1830s, Congress received more than 130,000 petitions from U.S. citizens wanting to abolish slavery in various forms, various places around the country. Unfortunately, what Congress did in all its wisdom in the 1830s is it imposed a gag rule on itself, which basically meant that for nearly a decade, Congress was not even allowed to discuss the issue of slavery. From about 1836 to 44, I believe. And so all these petitions were sent, and they banned themselves from even considering them or reading them on the floor of Congress. One of the biggest critics of that gag rule was John Quincy Adams, former president who had returned to Congress as a Massachusetts representative. So I think that's what I've got. This is the site of the church, which Methodist Church is now on Church Street, but it was formerly here, and that is where the Franklin County Anti-Slavery Society was founded.
And Ari are not here, but they did share some information about their mural. So Rachel and Ari drew inspiration from the art of Aaron Douglas and the stories of the Underground Railroad to symbolize the human impact of the anti-slavery movement in their mural. The piece marks the importance of this location as a site where anti-slavery ideas were furthered and hopefully where hearts were opened to the idea of abolition and equality. The image represents the local landscape of the Greenfield area with the North Star as both a moral and literal element. The periwinkles at the bottom symbolize the people who never made it to freedom for the hundreds of years slavery was allowed to persist. Periwinkle is a common ground cover on grave sites, including those of enslaved people.
You have plenty of time. Our next stop is just in front of the YMCA, so we don't have long, and you have plenty of time to take a look at the mural. This site was one of the homes of a prominent lawyer in Greenfield, George T. Davis, whose likeness you can see on the mural. In addition to being a lawyer locally, he was a Massachusetts representative, a senator, and later a United States representative from Massachusetts in Congress. So he obviously embraced sort of political action as a way to improve the United States, and particularly with respect to slavery. He was one of the founding members of the Anti-Slavery Society that we just spoke about back there. He was the first treasurer, I believe, and later the vice president of that group. He would later have, or I'm not sure if it's simultaneous or later, have another home that will pass by where, or will come close to where the Cooperative Bank is on Federal Street, just down here around the corner. Carol may have a little bit more to say about George Davis, so I'm going to pass it off to her.
Thank you, Luke. Yes, I'm actually interested in sneaking in another historical figure from Greenfield, and that is George Davis's brother, Wendell Davis. Both were attorneys here in town. Both lived in this general vicinity. John Putnam, the black barber, and we'll learn more about him as we move along, played at parties here in this neighborhood. In particular, I have an article where he was here for Wendell's daughters, playing music with his orchestra, and it was some sort of a birthday party, as I recall. So the two men worked together in the law office. They're described as being very close, and so I wanted to give Wendell a little acknowledgement too, since we're in this vicinity. I think Wendell was very close to John Putnam. He also rented space to him, not space we're visiting today, but there's reason to believe that both Davis brothers were very, very dedicated to this particular time and the climate in Greenfield. And that's about it. The artist here is Lee Moonen. Lee, are you here? Lee, come forward, please. Yay, wonderful. Lee, would you like to come and say a little something about your mural? Yeah.
No, we can't hear.
You are a celebrity. Please.
I didn't really prepare anything, just thank you everyone for being here, and I was inspired definitely by Davis just putting in his part, doing his part, and his brother too. I'm really close with my sister. She actually helped me with the mural too, so I like the, the sibling relationship and working towards justice. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the walk.
Can you tell us your sister's name?
My sister's actually right there, Katie Moonen.
Take a question?
Sure. A question.
Talk a little bit about painting on concrete. And how long do you expect this to last?
I mean, that would be, Christian is the expert on this, but we're hoping about a year at least, or maybe more. It was definitely challenging. I got pretty sore from, crouching a lot. But it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next
Just
stop
lie
is
down
also
in
pretty.
the middle of it.
Great, thank you.
Our next stop is this next house, the blue house right up here. So take your time.
Now you get to get sore from... Don't Katie, come on. Siblings for justice. Always a good idea. Take off your... Thank you. Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Thanks so much for speaking. I know you said you didn't really want to. It's okay. Okay. Yeah.
You did great.
Doesn't look like anyone's even walked on it. I think people probably tend to avoid.
Dad, David, Christian, who organized everything.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we're great.
We haven't met either, and Katie. Great job. I've done some of our projects at home. Any details are really good.
Yeah. We got the training from the
Try to do my best. Here we are at the former home of Billy Elliot, and I don't just mean the site. The actual building is still the original building where Billy Elliot lived. Elliot was a merchant. He worked at a place called Kendall's Store, which I think was on the corner of Main and Federal. He was also an insurance salesman at some point. And he was the secretary and treasurer of the Franklin County Anti-Slavery Society. So he had that involvement openly. but he was also rumored to have used this home to harbor fugitive slaves on their path to freedom. Our information for that comes from 1934 in the Greenfield Recorder. There was an old timers remarks section, which I wish we would bring back in the recorder. And his house here was referred to as, quote, a frequent place of refuge for slaves fleeing from southern captivity and a stopover point for those on the road to Canada. This is similar to the story of Dexter and Eunice Marsh, where we started, in that information about Underground Railroad activity is typically through oral histories, rumors, stories passed down through families, often years or decades later. And there's really good reason for that, because it was a federal crime to assist fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad, particularly after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 really kind of tightened the screws on any sort of assistance, even here in the North. And so you didn't want to keep records that you were doing so, because you were committing a federal crime. So this lack of kind of hard evidence can be frustrating, but it's not just local, it's sort of anywhere in the North. You rarely get really, really hard evidence of Underground Railroad activity. The one place that it can be found, there was a black abolitionist in Philadelphia that's kind of become known as the father of the Underground Railroad. William Still was his name, who kept meticulous, detailed records of helping, I think, over 600 fugitive slaves through his home and other homes in Philadelphia. And he published that in the 1870s after the abolition of slavery and after the Civil War. But outside of that, there's very little hard evidence. And so Dexter and Eunice Marsh, Billy Elliot, they kind of get passed down through word of mouth stories decades later. Carol, you have other things to say?
I do. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? I'm trying to hold this mic a little closer to my mouth. Yeah, I'd just like to put in a quick plug for Billy Elliot's beautiful wife, Experience Swan was her maiden name, and to just share another connection with John Putnam. When John Putnam first came to town, we believe he lived on Mill Street in a house that was the old Benjamin Swan home. Benjamin and his brother came to Greenfield and settled in the Cheapside area. So Experience and Billy are both buried in the same cemetery with John Putnam, and that's Green River. I think about half of the people whose homes we're visiting today are buried at Green River, and it's a great place to visit if you haven't been there. Lots of connections with abolitionists. Thank you.
Just one more thing about the lack of historical record. We don't have a certain number of enslaved folks who used the Underground Railroad. The best estimates are somewhere between 80 and 100,000 over the course of mostly the 19th century. And so to put that into context, that's something like 1% or less of enslaved people in America. So I think it's important to note that, because it's you don't want to overestimate how easy or hopeful it could have been to attain freedom. The vast majority of enslaved people lived and died as enslaved people. And so it's important to remember that, particularly if you were enslaved further in the Deep South. Most of those who did use the Underground Railroad successfully or otherwise were from sort of border states in the northern part of the South. And then lastly, I'm going to make a little plug for the church to the right here. Most recently, I think the Korean Zion Baptist Church. I think it's owned by the YMCA now. There's no mural there, but it does have a little role. This church was moved here from Barre, Massachusetts. And when it was in Barre, it was a well-known stop on the abolitionist speaking circuit. So folks like William Lloyd Garrison, probably the most prominent and outspoken abolitionist, spoke there a number of times. And then it was moved here. I don't actually know the year or recall the year. So its history in the abolitionist movement was elsewhere, but it is here. And I think the bell was moved to the Congregational Church, but I don't know if it's still there or if it's...
It cracked.
It cracked,
They
as
melted
bells
it
do.
down and gave those bells away and then put a new bell in.
It cracked, it was melted down, made into new bells, and given away. That's amazing. All right, so the artist for Billy Elliot's home here, where's the mural? Mural's up there, is Robert Markey. And is Robert here today? All right, Robert. Would you like to say a word or two about the mural? Or we could also read the statement if that's... Yeah, please.
No, it was just so good to be part of this. Talking about the. I can't talk to you. I got to talk to the camera. It was really good to be part of this abolitionist movement. It's so important in the history, and it was interesting that this house is still here. It's one of the few houses that's still there, so I had to do the house and then the portrait of him in front of the house. And the sidewalk is pretty rough there, so it was a little difficult getting precise stuff on that sidewalk, but it's done.
Thank you. Next one is right up on the corner, another short walk.
Okay, take your breaks up. Yep, take your breaks up.
The church was moved in the 1930s. 1930s. They were clearing the land for the plaza.
Ah, that makes sense. If I had thought that one through, I could have probably figured that out, but thank you.
I don't know.
I love baby girl. How about dry? Mommy?
I've never seen it. Oh, thank you. Well, I have to speak to teenagers all day, so I got a lot of practice.
Have fun, baby girl.
Not sure about the next one.
I don't personally know a ton about George Grinnell, so I'm going to be reading a lot of notes here. Grinnell was a lawyer in town, another founding member of the Franklin County Anti-Slavery Society. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1828 and served for 11 years. He was very vocal in Congress, and we'll see this thematically in the mural, trying to encourage Congress to extend diplomatic relations to Haiti, which had recently become the first independent black republic and a known sort of lightning rod for American fears of slave rebellion because of the Haitian Revolution. He was the president of the Troy and Greenfield Railroad Company. According to the Greenfield Gazette, he, quote, took an early positive stand in favor of human freedom and equal rights. He served as a Greenfield delegate in 1854 to a mass meeting in Worcester, which adopted a resolution condemning the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act extended the possibility of slavery in those new territories out west, which was a very clear violation of an earlier compromise that slavery would not exist above a certain line of latitude. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act reopened the possibility of slavery in those huge territories. So it ignited a new wave, that as well as a few other events, ignited a new wave of abolitionism in the mid-1850s. So he was a delegate to a Massachusetts meeting condemning that act. He also organized a public meeting to protest South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks when he savagely beat with his cane Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who was an outspoken abolitionist and had insulted the Southern congressman's family for being slave owners. Now, in terms of the house, down the street, you can't see it, but a few hundred yards down the street on the right, there is a yellow sort of Cape-style house, and that house apparently formerly was the Grinnell house on this site and was moved. Apparently, people used to move buildings a lot more than they do now. Yes, yes, that's the one. And then he constructed a larger house that still stands here today. He was obviously a very successful and prominent lawyer in town. The artist we have is Yumi, who's seated right here. A lot of you probably can't see her, but I'll hand her the microphone and she'll talk to you about the mural.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? And maybe I'll stand where you are. It's actually covering the arrow, which is okay.
You want to stand here so the camera can see?
Right in the street, but not too far. This mural, if you can't see it, is a almost like a doily, a lace. Maybe a woman made it many years ago, and it has the words "Grinnell lived here." Abolitionist, senator, advocate, recognizing Haitian independence. Advocate for recognize, and that's sewn into the doily. In the center is a figure of liberty. She's holding a stick with a hat, and this hat is historically a hat of liberation going back before the U.S., before the slave triangle, back to Greece, or I have to find the earliest date. It happens to be also a symbol for the Paris Olympics this year. So you might see that little hat and know it's something about freedom. The two shells are the conch, which is the pink and white shell with a the larger shell. This shell, with the end cut off, was used as a trumpet. There's a statue in Port-au-Prince in Haiti for the first call to rebellion. So there's a statue of the first person who trumpeted to say, "We're doing this, let's go." And this is the family shell, the whelk, the Massachusetts relative of the conch, is the second shell. There is a red arrow pointing to the location, which is based on Haitian traditional sacred art. It has a small Sankofa heart, which is from West Africa, that we learned from our past, and it has the star, which will show up in many of our Juneteenth imageries. Thank you. I don't know if the female anti-slavery societies have been mentioned yet on the tour. I got here at the last one, but women all over Massachusetts organized competitively and by town to raise money with things they made for anti-slavery work. And I saw a copy from back then of a table in Faneuil Hall where they also were selling shells to raise money.
Okay, fine. Then we won't get you any. No problem. Okay. I'm sorry.
Why? That stood out to me. I've asked people around here.
I know. I like really hearing about all the sequels on that.
took weeks for them to do this, but I work on for it.
Shade and a wide sidewalk. Let's take our time here. I think we were making Christian nervous up at the last one. So this is the Levitt Hovey House, as we all probably know it as the Greenfield Public Library, former library. The home of Jonathan Levitt, who's depicted in the mural. He was a member of the Levitt family that was a very prominent family of abolitionists in the county. So he was one of three brothers: Jonathan, who lived here; Roger, who was a farmer in Charlemont; and Hart, who I believe also lived in Greenfield. I'm not sure what he did for work. The family has quite an extensive record of abolitionist activity. It's sort of hard to keep straight because there's so many, and then you'll see that there's further generations of Levitts named for previous generations, so that you'll get confused. But Jonathan's brother, so we'll start with Roger, who was a farmer in Charlemont, was the president of the Franklin County Anti-Slavery Society. His wife, Chloe, was known to actively collect signatures for anti-slavery petitions sent to Congress. And I believe that, and I'll let the artists speak for themselves, but I believe that's what's reflected with the signatures on the jacket here. Jonathan, who lived here, and his older brother Hart, they settled in Greenfield. Jonathan was a judge. Hart, oh, here it is. Hart was a merchant. And they both were founding members of the Anti-Slavery Society. Jonathan's wife, Amelia, her father was Ezra Stiles, who would later become president of Yale. He was a congregational minister, and he was the president of the Connecticut Society for the Promotion of Freedom, another abolitionist society. What seems a bit confusing is that he had formerly purchased slaves himself, or decades earlier, and later emancipated them. Those very same enslaved people who were emancipated were then hired by his daughter decades later. So here in this house lived a number of free African Americans. Vincy was a nursemaid, Jim described as a manservant, and Eliza a cook. The two that her father had actually purchased and later emancipated were Newport and Nabby, who came to Greenfield with Amelia briefly, but later returned to New Haven. Remember, her father, who had owned those folks, was the president of Yale. I believe he emancipated them upon taking the position as president of Yale. So Nabby and Newport left Greenfield and went back to live in New Haven, Connecticut. Roger Levitt, that's the brother that was in Charlemont, had two sons, Joshua and Hart, both of whom kind of became involved more nationally as abolitionists in various societies and various abolitionist newspapers. A historian listed Roger's other son, Hart, as one of the Franklin County Underground Railroad operators, quote, a sturdy abolitionist who did all he could to help slaves gain their freedom. So the entire Levitt family were very much involved, officially and in some cases unofficially or secretly, on the Underground Railroad. The artist here, and Carol, I don't know if you have any words to say, but the artist can also speak if she chooses. Melissa Pandina. Is Melissa here? I believe she's here.
Thank you so much for letting me come and paint for y'all. Closer to my mouth. Okay. So I definitely got everybody confused in the Levitt household. The signatures are the the petition signatures. It was really fun to go and get historical signatures and get to take real names off of the real petitions. The Emancipator was one of the newspapers that they worked on. This is Jonathan Levitt. There is a tiny little portrait of him that survives that is about this big. And it just shows his work. Those are the abolitionist signatures. Can you stand in front of it and take a picture?
Very cool that the signatures are the actual names from petitions. I did not know that. Also of note, the building was designed by Asher Benjamin, who was briefly lived in Greenfield, one of the most prominent early architects in American history. And there was something else I was going to say. Maybe I'll remember by the next stop. The next stop is just on the corner here. It is one of the sites we will see of John Putnam, one of the more fascinating characters in this tour. So just up on the corner of Federal and Main.
Help from everyone, but yes.
Hired artists.
Yep.
Somewhere,
That's a lot of past research. Come on.
So you did it. Is the cutting still there?
Okay. Well, it's a good thing because if you, even if you.
Corner of Federal and Main was the site of the Mansion House. Mansion House, I really encourage people, it's easy to just Google and find some old photos of Mansion House. It was built in the 1820s, and it was a hotel and various shops on the first floor going on both streets. Unfortunately, it burned down, I believe, in 1959, and replaced. I'm not sure what was happening architecturally in the 60s, but it was replaced with the bank here. Sorry, to Greenfield Savings Bank. But the Mansion House was really cool. It's a cool thing to see what Greenfield used to look like downtown here. And in Mansion House on the first floor was one of the sites of John Putnam's barbershops. So John Putnam, Carol is sort of an expert on John Putnam, so I'll say a few things and hand it over to her. But John Putnam was a free black man who lived here in Greenfield. He was a barber. He was a very well-known and well-liked fiddle player. He was hired to play at parties and dances and such all around the county. And he was a known conductor and sort of center of information on the Underground Railroad. It's believed that his role as a barber gave him the sort of necessary contacts and references to really be able to pass information along and help out with fugitive slaves coming through western Massachusetts. I've got an image of John Putnam that I really like, and I'm going to pass them around so folks can, they're just printouts and you can take them and pass them around. We're going to visit at least one more site of, I think he had 3 different barbershops at different times, more. Another site and another mural will come soon. So I'm going to hand these out and hand it over to Carol to tell you a little bit more about John Putnam. Yeah.
Thank you, Luke. Yes, I don't know that I'm an authority on John Putnam, but I have done a lot of research on him. He's a real hero to many of us, and he, at this location, he actually has ads advertising not so much the barber shop in those terms, but bathing rooms where you could go and have access to hot water and a bath if you wanted to, but also have your hair done, cut or whatever. Back in those days, now he came to Greenfield, I found, in 1842, and that's significantly earlier than we had thought before. He and his wife Julia settled on Mill Street, were there for quite a few years before moving to Wells Street. And the house on Wells Street is no longer there. I discovered just a few years ago that the house across from John Putnam's home was owned by the John O'Hare. The O'Hare family was a family I married into back in the early 70s. So I know a lot about the O'Hares, but I didn't make the connection that that house was located across from where the other house, John's, had been. There's a lot to say about him, but we're not exactly in the shade here, so I'm going to just make this short, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or try to as we walk along or when we get to the next Putnam site. All right, now the artist here is Yumi again. And Yumi, can you come forward again? And you're so eloquent, I'd like you to say a little something more for us all.
I don't want to keep everybody in this bright sun too long either, but I'll be along for the tour. I couldn't hear from far away, so I don't know if you read the message. No. So this was what the words here say: to the dancing community, one and all, I am yet alive and still in the field, John Putnam. This was an advertisement he took out in the newspaper to let people know that he was available to call the dances and, you know, to help us all to freedom is the way I feel about it. So the stars here represent the Juneteenth flag stars, which are the supernova, or the birth of a star, and the scissors are for the hair cutting, which is also not an easy job, but helps us too.
And I should have said, but I think it's probably obvious, John Putnam's work was largely with prominent white community members, lawyers, doctors, businessmen, and others. Thank you, Yumi and Luke, and onward.
Our next stop, we're going to go down, take a right on Federal and to the Greenfield Cooperative Bank, and then we'll be back here on Main Street after that stop.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you there walk right here. I'm so sorry.
Oh, yeah. Already met in front of the Y was where we spoke about George Davis. He was a prominent lawyer, politician, and a founding member of the Anti-Slavery Society in Franklin County. So this was a second home of his at some point. And the artist, can you guess? Yumi. Come on forward, Yumi. We really put her to work.
Well, it's truly been an. There's one other artist who painted 3 and 6 other. So we're a group of 8 artists, and it's an honor for all of us to share this history and our art. This is based on the Juneteenth flag. It has a star at the center from the Lone Star State, and the open space around it is the supernova that I mentioned on the other mural, the birth of a star, which we are all the birth of a star. The hearts you saw, that's the Sankofa symbol from West Africa that we learned from our history. The bird is also the Sankofa bird. We turn around and look back to our past, no matter how difficult it is, and take something of value from it. There are other symbols.
Again, so this is another site of one of John Putnam's barbershops. So we've already heard about John Putnam. We can say a little bit more, especially the anecdote about his so-called actual physical tunnel the rumor of a tunnel at his house that was used to assist fugitive slaves that may or may not have existed. But the artist here, you see it, Jay, is Jonathan Ramirez. He is not local and not here. Is that right? But I'd like to read just a little description of what he put together, which I just lost on my phone, but I'll bring up. The mural depicts Putnam's storied life as a musician, with music physically flowing off of Putnam's fiddle and onto the sidewalk. Alongside the portrait are footprints encouraging passersby to dance along, just as one would have with Putnam, as their dance caller at social events. A special detail in the mural is Putnam's handedness. He was left-handed. As a businessman, barber, musician, and very likely supporter of abolition, John Putnam was and is an integral part of the Greenfield community. Carol, would you like to say more about John?
Actually, I'm going to pull a fast one here. Two people talked to me and know quite a bit about John Putnam, so I'm going to, and now I see expressions, I'm going to ask Kay Lyons to tell me a couple things about John, and then I'll ask Sandy Thomas. So these people become knowledgeable, you know, as we go along, and then they impress me so much that I think they ought to show their enthusiasm too.
Thank you. Well, I worked for many years at the Levitt Hovey House, aka Greenfield Public Library, and my space was the ballroom. The children's room was the former ballroom of the house, I was told. And I can't imagine that John Putnam did not play dances over there, and I swear I could feel him. But the thing that intrigues me about his role in the community is that out at what's now our fairgrounds, it was a training ground for Civil War soldiers, and those enlisted people and their officers had to get their hair cut, didn't they? And one can only imagine the sort of information that could be passed along in the barber's chair. Think about the things you talk about in the barber's chair. Think about the connection that he gave them with the lives that they left to come here, and think about what they knew of what troop movements might have been happening and what abolitionist activities might have been happening. It just fascinates me. Somebody should make a movie. That's what I told Carol I wanted mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. That's wonderful. And here's good sport. Miss Sandy Thomas, Mrs. Sandy Thomas. My apologies.
No worries. John Putnam, I love him, I love him, I love him. He, just everything that's been said about him, his activities in this community were critical to helping the Underground Railroad and to giving joy to people through his dance. He was called Old Put in his band. He never missed a concert in 40 years, through snowstorms, through anything. He never did not show up. He was always there. And very talented. He had an amazing laugh, it was told. And when we opened up the energy park, we put him on the train. There's a train.
I happened to be buying this lawnmower from Facebook Marketplace and for weeks I had
just these little tiny tips. Art tips. Good job, sorry. What church are you in?
Hey, how are ya?
Two more.
Do you have water?
So this is a site that I actually only recently learned about, and haven't myself wasn't part of the original tour that I gave. So I've got some notes about it, and the mural's quite a beautiful one. It was the site of the house of Charles and Emmeline Fisk. In 1895, a Greenfield resident wrote to Ohio State University professor Wilbur Siebert. He's the one I mentioned at the last stop, who was collecting information about Underground Railroad activity across Massachusetts. So a Greenfield resident wrote to him about Dr. Charles Fisk and his wife Emmeline, who sheltered fugitives in their Main Street home, which was somewhat corroborated by Fisk's son, Charles Jr., who wrote to the historian and described his father as, quote, a great and early pioneer in the anti-slavery cause. A subsequent history of Greenfield, written in 1954, also called the Fisk home a, quote, frequent refuge of the fugitive slave in his search for freedom. The artist here is Melissa Pandina, and who's not with us right today. Oh, she is. I'm sorry. Oh, we already. I apologize. Come on over. Confusing you with a different one of the artists.
This is my favorite one that I got to do. So in my research about the Underground Railroad, they talked about how quilts were used to communicate past. So I got to take our beautiful landscape here in Greenfield and turn it into a quilt. I also really love this, some of the spirituals that gave information about the path to follow. So in junior high, I learned about the song Follow the Drinking Gourd, and it's followed me all this time. So we have the Big Dipper in the quilting as a landmark. It also has a lot of the lanterns that were used as communication on the path, and we see somebody self-liberating and finding her way to freedom.
Thank you, Melissa. Just one thing I'll add. I have a note that Charles Fisk, also during his lifetime was a depot master on the Underground Railroad when he lived in Killington, Connecticut. So thank you, Dr. Fisk, and this isn't our last.
No, we have
One more to go, and here you go.
Yeah, we saved the best for last, in my opinion. The last one is right at the Veterans Mall. We'll meet you there.
No, this is the best. This is my favorite out of all of them.
This is definitely my favorite one.
Yeah.
Nine going on 21.
I have had a conversation with another night.
Yeah.
We'll be open tomorrow.
No, I'll be good. I got the sneakers. So.
You got the sneakers, you're good.
Yeah, I'm more than halfway there. I got my uniform. Yeah, you.
Right, our last stop, and again, my personal favorite. This was, or just here in the Veterans Mall, was the site of Washington Hall, built in 1857. It served, I think the ground floor was the town hall, and the upper floor, one of the upper floors had sort of an auditorium that served as a entertainment space, a place to host visiting lecturers, which was, as we've already talked about, one of the more common abolitionist activities was to sort of spread the word via lecture. This is, of course, before screens and social media. The way to get the word out about something was to, believe it or not, speak face to face to folks and not just tweet about it. So anyway, Washington Hall was a common stop on the lecture circuit for various things: literary, philosophical, and political. And so some known speakers were known to have come to Greenfield. Ralph Waldo Emerson. I'm thinking of the Parker. Henry Ward Beecher, Theodore Parker. Theodore is the name I was thinking of. And what really amazed us is just a few years ago, the Greenfield Historical Society found in their records, I don't know if you were part of this, they brought it to my attention because I was teaching history at the high school. They found what you see in the mural, a pamphlet or playbill announcing a visit by Frederick Douglass, who came here to speak in January of 1866. So, Douglass, I'm sure you've at least heard of, was a prominent, probably the most prominent abolitionist speaker in America, was internationally known. He, give a very brief history, because I could probably talk for hours about him. He was born enslaved in Maryland as Frederick Bailey, the last name of his owner. He was largely self-taught. He was known to sort of be sneaky and offer to carry books home from some of the white boys in the neighborhood, so he could kind of like get a quick lesson from them. One of the wives of one of his owners also helped him briefly until she was told to stop, learn how to read and write. He also fought back physically against some slave masters of his as a teenager, and he escaped. I forget the exact age, late teen years or early 20s. He escaped and found his way to Massachusetts, lived for a while in New Bedford, and I think later in either Lynn or Lawrence. But in Massachusetts, he was sort of discovered in a way by William Lloyd Garrison as an incredibly eloquent speaker. So that Garrison started to bring him along. I think the first recorded sort of lecture that Douglass gave was on Nantucket. And he was so eloquent and so kind of spellbinding as a speaker that people sort of doubted he had been enslaved or grew up as an enslaved person. So much so that his most famous piece of writing, his autobiography, which should be required reading of all Americans, is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. He wrote in part to prove to people that he had in fact been enslaved. So he wrote his entire story down. He briefly went to England, both to lecture and also to raise money for the abolitionist cause. He also found funding there to purchase his freedom officially, so that he was no longer in danger of being arrested and returned to the South. So he later moved to upstate New York, Rochester, but he basically spent 8 to 10 months a year on the lecture circuit, going as far west as Ohio and Indiana, but especially around New England. And as we see in 1866, he spoke right here at Washington Hall. So you'll note from the date that 66, the Civil War has recently ended, the 13th Amendment has passed and slavery is abolished, and President Lincoln has somewhat recently been assassinated. So we don't have any record of his lecture in Greenfield, but he was known at any given time. He would often be giving the same lecture in multiple places, and around that time, most of his lectures had to do with the assassination of Lincoln, his legacy, and the sort of ongoing work that America had to do to sort of live up to what all of that meant. So that's most likely what he spoke about here in Greenfield, though we don't have a record of it exactly. Anything, Carol? We talk about the artist. I had more to say as well.
I wanted to just mention that Washington Hall was quite a destination, and it also included a basketball court in later years, and just was an active place where the community could come together. And by that I mean the white and black community. And I feel it housed the library. Yes. Okay, the original library in town. And it also housed the town offices downstairs, I know. Yeah. Thank you, Kay.
All right, so before I introduce the artist, because I'm a teacher, I'm going to leave you with some reading to do. I mentioned his autobiography, but if you'd like some other amazing pieces of oratory, his most famous speech possibly was, I think we're actually getting, am I right that there's a reading of, he was invited to give a speech in 1852, I believe, out in Rochester on the occasion of Independence Day. I'm not sure what those folks were thinking he was going to speak about, a formerly enslaved man talking about freedom in the 1850s when, over 3.5 million folks in this country did not have freedom, but he sort of stunned the audience with quite a rebuke of this idea that we truly stand for freedom in America. So that speech is I consider one of the most powerful in American history, and I think there's a reading of it happening today. I'm seeing nodding heads as part of the Juneteenth celebrations. And then one more piece of reading, because I know you're all going to go home and do your homework, is he once also wrote a letter back to his former slave owner. That's called A Letter to Thomas Auld, A-U-L-D, and it's amazing, and it's not terribly long, but what a former slave would say to his previous master is it's powerful, and I often have students read it. So I encourage you to check those things out. They're easy to find online. So the artist here is, again, Melissa.
So they already talked about the playbill that was really wonderful, being able to try to copy it. But my favorite part about this mural was sitting with Douglas for 2 days and painting him and getting to be intimately aware of his face and the pride of his demeanor. I had definitely read those two, the letter and that speech before I had started. So getting to know Douglas better just by painting him and seeing how he carried himself was really fun. And he's one of the most photographed people of that time period, which is really interesting. So the other things you're going to find are names of other speakers that spoke at Washington Hall, and a small, tiny, itty-bitty portrait that doesn't really do well on such a rough surface is Henry Ward Beecher. And I really love that in the site you had both literary speakers and political speakers, especially the transcendental movement, and to see how entwined those two things were.
all for turning out today. If any of you want to continue to do research on this, if you scan the QR code next to any of the locations or on the pamphlets that you all had, there's a web page with information on the history of each site, information on the artist artwork that they created, as well as photographs of each mural to perpetuity. So, thank you.